Well, guess what? The first time that I did anything here was 1946. And I was a freshman, and our English assignment was to write a kind of glad to be here speech. And my speech was chosen, so that was my first talk that I gave here, 1946. So you can appreciate the years that have passed since then. It seems to me that I've spent most of my life trying to listen to my very loud call to be an artist and my very persistent call to be a religious. It's a difficult thing to put together, at least I felt it was difficult. But looking back, I remember the cover on my little First Communion prayer book. I'm sure none of you had prayer books like this. It was sort of it wasn't really plastic because that didn't exist. Celluloid, I think it was. And it had a delicately lipsticked Mary emerging from a bower of flowers. The boys' prayer books were even worse. A meticulously permed blonde hair with big blue eyes pointing to his heart. I learned very early to reject this sentimental art that prevailed in my youth, and it still prevails today, unfortunately. But my question for many years has been where to go from there, you know. I think I must have started drawing before I could talk. But as a child, I had no art lessons. My family was a family of makers. My grandmother embroidered, sewed, knitted, crocheted, and made gorgeously decorated birthday cakes. She was a maker, a first-degree maker. My mother sewed stylish outfits with Vogue patterns and was parish famous for her amazing hats. She specialized in special hats, and this caused quite a bit of waiting to see what Marie would show up with on Easter. Yeah. My Uncle Francis was a woodworker. My Uncle Lawrence was an architect, a watercolor painter, and finally a Jesuit. So you see, I had a family of makers, or I had a family of makers to support me. From my earliest years, my Uncle Lawrence furnished me with paper, paint, and critical appreciation. He always wanted to see what I was doing. He took me on regular pilgrimages to the Cleveland Museum of Art, and we spent many Sundays tramping through houses under construction and checking design and construction details. In those days, you could do that. No, I don't think you can do it anymore. He warned my mother not to let me take art lessons from Mrs. Gardner because all the children did was copy calendars. So I avoided that, which was good. I can't remember a time when I was not making things. And I have to thank my mother, who never complained about my messy projects, including the gallons of flour paste I made and dripped all over the kitchen and dining room. She even gave me my very own workplace in the dining room, a small table in the corner. It was her workplace too. That's where she sewed. So we did eat in the dining room also, but basically the making part was the important part. As I look back, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is for parents not only to tolerate, but to encourage their children's interests, even when they're messy and weird, pointless, and inconvenient. It's very important that the child have a little independence in choice and in the way he works out. I remember I collected water for a while. I had water from Lake Erie, water from the Cuyahoga River, water, you know, what to do with water in bottles. I mean, it wasn't exactly a brilliant collection, but it was mine, you know, and that was okay. So let your kids have their own way of expressing themselves, and don't worry about the mess. I was about 12 when I began to follow in my Uncle Lawrence's example by drawing and painting outdoors. I got started on this because each summer we went to New York to my father's home farm in the beautiful Genesee Valley of New York State. I loved the hemlock woods, the shale-banked creek, the distant blue hills, and especially the big farm horses. And I remember how delighted I was when I discovered the characteristic curve of the horse's back and started filling my sketchbook with horses. God's creation spoke to me in everything I saw, and I was eager to record it. I was in college before I took any formal art classes. Most of the teachers I had not really found their own voices as artists. They were working on it, but they were still learning themselves. They did their best to present in a rather superficial way the great modern artists as models that we might follow. Even though I learned the language of Cubism, Impressionism, the language of Matisse and the Fauves, the Surrealists, the German Expressionists, I privately lamented that I did not know how to proclaim the feelings in my own heart. When I finally got to graduate school, I was confronted with another popular theory or style. It was called abstract expressionism, and it taught that art, to be pure art, could have no visible reference or relation to the world, to the real world. Forget those curvy horses, forget those hemlock trees and blue hills and gray shale banks. Painting should not tell stories. They should not recall real things or horrors have a message. To call a painting literary was to condemn it. It had a story. Critics had strong opinions that art should be autonomous, that it should stand by itself. This was a very popular theory during the middle of the 20th century and still prevails among some artists, even though contemporary art criticism has left it far behind. Those who reject representation are really caught in a trap. There is meaning in what they do. No matter what you do as in making, there is a meaning behind it. Even their rejection of representation is a message. At that time, these theories, which I only partially understood, put a deep chill on my use of representation. I did not deny the validity of abstract art because I knew that abstractions can be powerful symbols and can really say something. It was a denial that a painting can have meaning that I could not accept. I wanted the art I made to say something. But as a student, I felt compelled to try painting in the style of abstract expressionism because I was a student, and abstract expressionism was the, quote, accepted style, unquote, of the day. And as a teacher, I later used to believe that it was a required virtue for students to have a certain temporary docility, in listening to the teacher and trying things out that the teacher suggested. I knew from my study of art history that the real artist is always pushed by her spirit to try something new, not just to be different or to be out in front of her time, but because the young artist is a different generation and does see things in a new way. After all, Ezra Pound, if you ever heard of him, had called artists the antennae of the race. When I was a graduate student at Ohio State, I met a frustrated girl whose version of abstract expressionism was a canvas full of writhing worms. She said she hated painting worms, but it was how her paintings always turned out. I could appreciate the theory of abstract expressionism, which called artists to be conscious of the physical act of painting. It didn't matter what you painted, you just painted and made a big mess. It glorified the act of painting. The finished painting was only the record of the battle, so to speak. For that girl, worms were not the answer, nor could I generate in my heart any passion for painting in that style. I still, in my heart, wanted to paint something that had meaning. I soon discovered that the whole cafeteria approach to style was fake. And it still had not given me any clue to my own language for painting. Where did this leave me as I sought my own voice as an artist? I did not like the pared down, sterile, disconnected from life version of art, but I lacked the sophistication and confidence to even talk about this openly. Now later, I was studying at Pratt Institute in New York, and I was meeting many people who were very different from me. Different experiences, customs, different ways of thinking, different costumes. It was a real experience. And I cautiously developed a style of painting that was geometric, apparently without meaning, but secretly symbolic and full of content. I alone had the key to these paintings, and I did not share it with anyone. But the problem remained. How could I put together what I knew of art history and philosophy with what I knew experientially as I struggled to be an artist and a Dominican religious, a member of the order of preachers? Now I began to wonder if perhaps my true art might be those watercolors that I had been making for so long, because I continued to paint just simple watercolors. And I loved the magic quality of light, which charges a landscape with unexpected drama. I was excited by the challenge of a nature that changed before my eyes as I painted. As the sun crosses the sky, you're painting. Well, if you try to change with the sky, you are in deep trouble. You have to hang in with the first vision you have. I tried to express the simple beauty of what I was seeing, unconcerned whether the paintings did or did not imitate what I saw. I thought of them more as songs or poems, variations on a theme of God's creation. Gradually, I discovered that making these paintings was becoming important to me as a way of integrating my life and paying personal homage to the creator of this beautiful world. Painting became my way of communicating with God, of applauding the beauty of creation. Finally, I realized that these paintings were saying something, and that I was saying something through them, and that their voices were indeed a kind of preaching. Pope John Paul II, in his letter to artists, and by the way, Pope John Paul was an artist. You remember he was an actor. And he apparently starred in many plays before he became Pope. Anyway, he has the heart of an artist. He says, "No one can sense more deeply than you artists, ingenious creators of beauty that you are, something of the pathos with which God at the dawn of creation looked upon the work of his hands. That feeling has sparkled so often in your eyes when captivated by the hidden power of sounds and words, colors and shapes. You have admired the work of your inspiration. You have sensed in it some echo of the mystery of creation with which God, the creator of all things, has wished in some mysterious way to share with you." I think he understood, and he was able to write it in a way that I think communicates some of the joy and the feeling of being an artist. By now I was teaching at Albertus Magnus College in New Haven, Connecticut, which you'll be interested to know is also getting a new president this year. I was painting, showing my work, and teaching. And I liked New Haven. It's a beautiful city, an old city, very different from Columbus. Beautiful architecture, and a good feeling there. A very nice museum belonging to Yale University, which was accessible, and which made it accessible to me as a teacher. It was a good place to be. Finally, it was my turn for a sabbatical. And I had the opportunity to choose where I might go, and I, of course, wanted to go someplace to paint. We had a mission in Peru, which you've heard of, I'm sure, and there were sisters there in the city, I should say, of Chimbote. So I decided that would be a perfect place to go because I would have a place to live, friends to be with, and I'd heard that Peru was indeed a very beautiful country. All those things proved to be true. Chimbote didn't look very good on the outside because it is a very poor city. It was a very poor city, and I don't know that it's gotten rich in the meantime. However, it had a beautiful bay with white islands floating in the blue Pacific. White islands. Well, those were the gift of the birds who left their deposits on the islands. And it looked like marshmallows floating in the, beautiful. Beautiful, really. Anyway, Chimbote soon claimed my heart. And the other thing, besides doing my own painting, I wanted to do something with the women because I had made a visit to Peru before I went down to paint. And I was painting then, but just for a couple weeks, it wasn't a big deal. But the women were standing in their doorways watching me and watching the children. Everybody gathered around. When I would take a stool and sit down and start to work, I would soon have an audience of 50 people around me, blocking my view. Por favor, un poco más. Trying to. But the women were afraid to come out and stand there and watch me. They would stand in their doors or watching. And finally, one woman did say to me, Madre, por favor, venga y enseñarnos para pintar. Teach us how to paint. So this grabbed me, and I realized that there was lots I could do. We could work on making things that would be saleable, and this would be helpful to the women in taking care of their children, buying shoes. Children couldn't go to class, couldn't go to school unless they had shoes, and that was a real challenge for many families. So in my planning for this trip to Peru, I included arriving at some kind of a handcraft that I could teach them or help them to develop themselves that would be saleable and that I could sell for their benefit. So that's basically what I spent a lot of my time doing. And what we developed were embroidered tapestries. They were very good at embroidery. They knew how to embroider. So we started drawing pictures of their life. We called them tapiceros de vivencia, little tapestries of life. And I'm sure that, many people helped me on this project, not only in Peru, but when I brought them home in suitcases. Yes. And you know what? I never had to pay any charge on them, any what do you call it? Duty, because I would explain briefly what they were doing, what I was doing, and they always let me go through without any questions. So people did help me sell them and people bought them. And I think we kind of wore out the tapiceros. I finally abandoned it because I sold tapiceros to everybody that I knew and people I didn't know. But they were beautiful, and I have very nice pictures of the best ones, which I would be happy to share with you. But anyway, the women were such a joy to work with. I remember the first time that I was able to hand out money to them. It wasn't much at all, but that was part of it, to encourage them to keep doing this. So this was a small kind of a promise for the future. And they were so excited. They said, vamos a la picanteria. Let's go to the bar. Because, well, that's not one of mine. That's not one of mine. It's nice, but they're different. I should have brought one over. Anyway, that's what their husbands did, when their husbands who worked unloading boats and doing humble things, didn't have regular jobs, but were always looking for jobs. That was their solution when they got their money, was to go to the bar. So anyway, this was a joke. The women did not go to the bar. They went home and got shoes for their kids. But anyway, this was the first time that I could observe closely in their own environment talented but unsophisticated artists and the work they were producing. They had never been to art school, and their intuitive appreciation of the goodness of their own work had not been corrupted. In other words, they worked simply. They weren't critical. They didn't look at the things and say, oh, I could never do that. I could draw a straight line. All those stupid things that people say. Because you don't have to draw a straight line, no? All right. Their best art is totally honest and without affectation. Usually it strikes us immediately as beautiful in its simplicity, in its honesty, and its portrayal of their real life. They weren't ashamed of their poverty. This was how they lived. How else could you live? This is it. It's important to mention that not all folk artists manage to preserve this purity of approach. I'm speaking of those whose prodigious natural gifts are unspoiled by fame or economic pressures. You can see how this could happen. And then they become affected and they lose the freshness of the original art. I realize that folk art, as it is usually labeled, is always made for a reason. It may illustrate an important story, or it might make a myth visible. It might express their feelings, recount history, or simply decorate, or simply show a moment in their daily life. A talented natural artist looks carefully but creatively at his world. The artist is not afraid to show his version of reality. This is how it is, along with his feelings about it. These artists are often challenged to make art that is based on their own cultural belief system. They do not work to win grants or to join the stable of a popular gallery or to make the cover of art news. They don't wait until they can afford expensive art materials. They use whatever material is available, even mud, not clay. They use used cans, straw, cardboard boxes, or other things that we consider trash. They might dream of having real artist colors. They portrayed in their tapestries their life in Peru, and this became for them and for me an effective way of making true and meaningful art that delights others and even preaches effectively. Finally, I saw how important it is that we realize that God has given us the arts for important reasons. Through the arts, we contribute to our society, and we express externally our humanity. So many people are drowning in science and math and economics, etc., all good things, but art is pushed aside as being not really necessary. I mean, how can you make a lot of money as an artist? Well, you actually can nowadays, but it's basically not something that is chosen usually as a way of becoming rich. Not only does this support of our humanity make our mental and physical health better, it also gives us an experience, a small experience, of the unique joy and delight that the Creator has had or has in his continuing grand work. In other words, I believe that creation is continuing to this day. It continues into the future. Because God is actually finishing the world with our hands. We are called to contribute to the finishing of the world, which in the end will be beautiful and will be God's work and our own work. You may want to ask, well, what about us who don't seem to have any notable artistic talent? Do we have any share in this? And of course, John Paul has the answer. He says, not all are called to be artists in the specific sense of the term, yet all are entrusted with the task of crafting their own life. In a certain sense, they are to make of it a work of art, a masterpiece. We Dominicans are fortunate to have an example to learn from, a great act to follow. Our own brother, Fra Angelico Giovanni da Fiesoli, that's his real name. It has taken a long time for him to be publicly recognized as a homilist as well as an artist. His paintings are actually homilies. He was born around 1400, but it wasn't until 1982 that Pope John Paul gave permission for a liturgical cultus in honor of Fra Angelico. That's a good picture, you know, that shows you how artists have been valued. The church especially, although artists have decorated many churches, still to recognize an artist as a saint, well, come on. Art demands tranquility, said Fra Angelico. And to paint the things of Christ, the artist must live with Christ. That's all we have. That's the only quote we have from him, but it's profound. It's the only remark that's been preserved. We are grateful that his preaching of the Word of God was in paint rather than in words. How many persons living today are still praying and learning from the homilies of preachers of 600 years ago? How many other fiery, famous preachers of the 15th century are still preaching? Not many, but Fra Angelico is still preaching through his art. The artist serves the needs of the community with more than enough. What do you mean, more than enough? Well, think of God's lavishly furnished world. You know, he wasn't stingy in his conception of creation, isn't stingy, I should say. It's a world that's full of beautiful things, good things to eat, all kinds of supportive measures. It's the world, when you look at creation, is amazing. And here's where science comes in. When you see those animals, how can you help but marvel at God's creativity? At the different, watching the elephants who crossed the Alps last night. You may have watched that. Anyway, God's creation continues. Think of how lavishly, when he created the water, when he changed water into wine at the wedding at Cana, it wasn't just enough, you know. It was like, how many gallons did he change? Think of the feast that was thrown on the spur of the moment for the prodigal son when he returned. Bring out the garments, bring out the, you know, kill the fatted calf. It was lavish, it was generous. And that's the way we have to be. We have to look at our talents in the same way, that our contributions to the world have to be without measure, not just, little bits of things. Well, she did that, so I guess I need to do this for her. No, come on. She did this for you. You can't give her enough now to thank her for it. The artist also makes things we need, like buildings, dishes, furniture, cars, textiles, and those can be made beautifully, lavishly. Primitive people were inspired to decorate the objects they made for daily life, pottery, knives, and clothes, and we search for those things. The artist gifts the community with more than enough in the same generous way that God gifts us. The artist brings the gifts of beauty and delight to the community. Think of the Sistine Chapel, Millennium Park in Chicago, fireworks displays, the Calatrava Art Museum in Milwaukee, the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, you could name so many ways that art really does enrich our lives without forcing it on. It's there, and we enjoy looking at it. And the community actually can evangelize the artist. The artist learns from community as the community learns from the artist, when they come together through participation in artistic activities. And I can think of a million examples of that, but I won't. The one thing I do want to say is the community needs to be conscious of calling forth its artists. What do you think of the builders of new churches who do not trust or appreciate the work of contemporary architects, but have to go back hundreds of years to old styles, which were fine in their day, but we have new materials, we have new knowledge of how to build, and the opportunity to build churches, schools, places of gathering places. We should be using the newest techniques and materials because this is what God has given us. Why should we go back to building Gothic churches? Gothic churches are beautiful and should be preserved, taken care of, and appreciated, but they are not the last word in architecture. It is the incarnation, the Word made flesh, who puts the materials of this world at our service and allows them to carry the burden of meaning and beauty that is our birthright, our creation right. Now, lest you think that artists have all the fun, there is a dark side to being an artist. Fritz Eichenberg, a great artist and printmaker, and I think a Quaker saint, describes it thus. This is his quote, most of the artists and writers I admired had labored under the problems of all nonconformists. You can see why an artist has to be a nonconformist. People of conscience and integrity who were sensitive to human frailties. Savonarola, Dorothy Day, Oscar Romero, Martin Luther King. You could name many. They faced the consequences. They stood there to be counted. They could do nothing else. This was their call. Very few escaped the wrath of the guardians of the status quo. The super conservatives, well, who said that? As long as they stayed within the boundaries of church and state, they were well treated. But when they spoke with the tongues of prophets, their fate was similar: to be imprisoned, silenced, driven into exile, or shot. It is art that somehow preserves the special vision, even the quirkiness of the artist's own personality, yet totally participates in the whole Christian worldview. It is art that enables others to see what the artist sees and feels, and for a moment to experience with the artist the exultation of being a creator, small c, in the vast universe of the world. So our art is praise and beauty when we are inspired by creation and reflect it back to God through our own lives and art.